you all hear me if I don't use a microphone? Usually I don't have a problem. Thank you, Catherine, for such a nice introduction. You know, when you give as many speeches as I do, you can't always be sure what kind of introduction you're going to get. The person introducing me at one event said, I, as your chairman, do not have to make a long and boring speech because we've invited Mitchell Bart for that. The other thing about giving a lot of speeches is you never know what kind of venue you're going to have. It's very nice to be in a lovely building like this. You know, I've spoken in basketball gymnasiums, in hot tub salesman's showroom. I was speaking at a private home, beautiful home in Boca Raton, Florida recently. I swear this is true. I got up, I gave my spiel, I sat down, and the family dog came over and shook my hand. You know, a lot of people, you know, when they come to speak to you, they always tell you, glad to be here. Well, I can tell you, I'm glad to be here because a year ago when I was on the book circuit, I was giving a speech and I had a heart attack. So I'm really glad to be here. But be gentle with me. Catherine actually gave a great introduction to the book because exactly as she said, the Israel lobby has been demonized and mischaracterized and become such a bogeyman in the media and on college campuses, and very few people have ever considered the possibility that there might be another lobby. And if you think about it, just common sense would tell you that on any issue you can think of, whether it's reproductive rights or gun control or health care or anything else, there's usually multiple interest groups on either side of the particular issue. So it really shouldn't come as a surprise that there is an Arab lobby, and yet the most prominent member of the Arab lobby, a guy named James Zogby, maybe you've seen on TV before, has said there is no Arab lobby. But in fact there is, and in fact it's also probably older than the pro-Israel lobby. It dates back really to the discovery of oil. And even before AIPAC was created, the King of Saudi Arabia had asked the CIA to finance an Arab lobby in the United States. And so there is a lobby, and it's very nefarious, but there are two parts of it. And one reason that there is this view that, excuse me, it's not so powerful is because it's focused, most of the focus tends to be on one part of it. And that's the domestic side. What I call the domestic lobby is made up of Arab Americans, Muslim Americans, Arabists in the State Department, and anti-Zionist Christians. And one of the reasons, well, actually there are three main reasons why the domestic Arab lobby tends to be not very influential. First of all, they don't lobby for anything. They lobby primarily against Israel. So that while their main agenda item is support for the Palestinians, almost nothing they do is in support of the Palestinians. They don't lobby, for example, for more aid for the Palestinians. They don't lobby in favor of a two-state solution. They don't lobby for anything, really, that supports the Palestinian cause. What they do primarily is lobby to cut off aid to Israel, to criticize Israel, to condemn Israel, to try to drive a wedge between the United States and Israel. Another problem that the Arab lobby has is they can't represent the quote-unquote Arabs, because after all, there are more than 20 Arab states with very different agendas. You can see what's going on now in the Arab world, that even within individual Arab countries, they don't have any agreements. So there's no way to represent the Arabs in the way that the pro-Israel community can represent one particular state's interests. Another issue with the domestic lobby is simply one of numbers. That is, there's only about 3 million Arab Americans in the United States. And of those 3 million, a significant proportion, at least 40%, some people say as high as 70 or 80%, are Lebanese Christians. And the Lebanese Christians are in the United States primarily because they were driven out of Lebanon by the Muslim and Palestinians. So they have very little sympathy for lobbying for the Palestinian cause. Another problem is that there's very little sympathy among the American public The latest Gallup poll showed that 67% of Americans support Israel and about 15% support the Palestinians. And so if you're a lobby going to Congress and your entire agenda is trying to beat up on Israel, you're not going to find a very hospitable audience. And so they have had relatively limited success in pushing any of their pro-Palestinian or mostly anti-Israel agenda. So it's easy for Walter Mearsheimer to say, look, the relationship between the United States and Israel is so strong, there can't be an Arab lobby. Well, the real strong Arab lobby is the oil lobby. And that's led primarily by Saudi Arabia with the help of State Department Arabis, the Defense Department, and various commercial interests who do business in the Middle East. And this has gone on really for 80 years. As I said, the Saudis have literally had us over a barrel. And you think about it today and you say, well, of course, the Saudis have the largest oil reserves. They have tremendous wealth. Of course, we need to pay attention to their interests. But we began to essentially kowtow to them before they were pumping any oil. It was decades before we became significant importers of Saudi oil. And for much of their early years, the Saudis were largely bankrupt and we were having to bail them out all the time. So it wasn't because they were so wealthy and we needed their oil. We simply were convinced, or presidents were convinced of both parties, by Arabis and the State Department, that the most important thing to the United States was guaranteeing the supply of oil, that we needed the Saudis to guarantee that supply, and the way to keep the Saudis supplying us oil was to make them happy, and what made them happy? Beating up on Israel. Well, in fact, that never really was the truth, because the Saudis really don't care that much about Israel. They care about one thing and one thing only. That's keeping their royal heads connected to their royal shoulders. And so typically a interaction between an American diplomat and the Saudi royals would be something like the first 5 minutes of the discussion would be the Saudis complaining about how much they hate Israel and the Zionists and the Jews and the U.S. support for them. And then the Saudi would say, but what we really care about is the Hashemites in Jordan. That was originally the reason why we made our first arms sale to the Saudis, to protect them from the Hashemites. Then it was NASA. Then it was the Soviet Union. And guess what it is now? Iran, which now the United States used as the pretext to sell $30 billion worth of weapons to the Saudis, the biggest arms sale in U.S. history. Obama just approved recently. It's part of a Faustian bargain that we have made with the Saudis, where basically we have said to them implicitly, we will keep your heads on your shoulders in exchange for you selling us oil. Now, the Saudis don't sell us oil out of the goodness of their hearts. They do it the way a drug pusher sells drugs to a drug addict. And what they do is manipulate the price of oil in such a way that they're always assured of making money, but the price of oil never goes so high that we are motivated to find alternative sources of energy. So, for example, you may remember about 3 years ago, oil reached an all-time high of $147 a barrel. Now, you would think the Saudis would have been pleased as punch. They were making billions. They would want it to go to 200, 300, 500. But at that very moment, the Saudi oil minister said the ideal price of oil for Saudi Arabia is between $70 and $80 a barrel. Guess what the price of oil was the next year, the average price? $75. The same thing is happening right now. Why is the price of oil not $200 a barrel, given all of the turmoil in the Arab world? It's because the Saudis are pumping more and more oil. Why are they doing it? Because they're doing us a favor? No. It's part of a bargain with the United States where, for one thing, they're getting the $30 billion worth of weapons, which we know they can't use and don't need, but we sell it to them in part to get some of the oil money back. But they're also sending a subtle message to the president. They're saying to President Obama, your economy's kind of shaky. If the price of oil skyrockets, your economy is going to go in the toilet, as will your chance for re-election. We're going to help you out. We're going to keep the price of oil low so that doesn't happen. And all you have to do is keep quiet about this democracy stuff. So you may have noticed that the president has become a big champion of freedom and democracy in Libya, in Syria, in Egypt, in Yemen, in every place but Saudi Arabia. Not a single peep about freedom and democracy in Saudi Arabia. This is one way the Saudis operate. Another way that they operate is in terms of buying influence. First of all, because there are no Saudi Americans to speak of, they have no grassroots lobby. So what they have to do is try to buy influence. So just since 9/11, they've spent over $100 million on public relations and lobbying firms in Washington to try to make the case that the Saudis are wonderful friends and allies of the United States. And behind the scenes, they are also lobbying directly. You know, one of the reasons I subtitled the book The Invisible Alliance is not because I believe there's this conspiracy the way that Walt and Mearsheimer see a Jewish conspiracy. It's not a conspiracy. It's invisible because you don't know most of what's going on. You just don't see it. It's not transparent the way AIPAC's actions are. You don't know that Prince Bandar, when he was the ambassador for 20-something years, 22 years, could basically walk into the White House whenever he wanted. No other person, no other ambassador had that kind of access. That he used to play racquetball and tennis with people like George Shultz and Colin Powell and James Jones and be able to influence that way. They also have a different way of influencing, and Bandar was very blunt about it. He said, if you take care of your friends when they leave office, you'd be surprised what good friends they are when they're in office. And so you have these former State Department, Defense Department officials get these very good jobs in think tanks and consulting firms and oil companies after they leave the government, if they've been good to the Saudis. And the people who are in the government see that. And so they know one day they're going to retire from the State Department and they need something to do. Why would it be in their interest to be in any way critical of the Saudis when they have a great golden parachute waiting for them when they get out? And this works with presidents as well. And again, I want to stress, it's very bipartisan. My favorite story is there was this obscure southern governor who asked the Saudis to give money for a Center of Middle East Studies at the state university. And the Saudis must have looked at him and said, you know, we don't even know where this southern governor's state is. Well, a few months later, that obscure governor became the Democratic candidate for president. And lo and behold, the university got $3.5 million for a Center of Middle East Studies. Well, then that obscure governor, Bill Clinton, became the president. And guess what? Right after his inauguration, the University of Arkansas got $20 million. And now they have a wonderful Center of Middle East Studies in the University of Arkansas. This is the way they buy influence. Now, why is this a problem? Why should we care? You know, I'm not like Walt and Mearsheimer who try to say that the Saudis or the Arab Americans don't have a right to lobby. As long as they obey U.S. laws, they have every right to try to influence our government however they like. You know, that's the way democracy works. The problem is, what are the impact of the Saudi lobby? And they have three main impacts which are very damaging to the United States. First, they undermine our values. Secondly, they undermine our interests. And most significantly, they threaten our security. First, how do they undermine our values? Well, what do we believe in? We believe in freedom, democracy, human rights, civil rights, women's rights, gay rights. None of those things are practiced in Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is one of the biggest human rights abusers in the world. You know, there's this canard often bantered about Israel being like South Africa used to be. Well, I can tell you, the one country that is similar to South Africa is Saudi Arabia, because if you replace the word black with woman, you have an apartheid regime in Saudi Arabia, the way it treats its women. Just to give you an example, maybe you read about this last week, 2 weeks ago. The Saudis just beheaded a woman for being a witch or a sorcerer. This is the kind of thing that goes on routinely there. And as I said, the United States is unwilling to speak up about it. It's been going on for decades, where they discriminate against Christians, against Jews. For years, the State Department would say, don't send any Jews to Saudi Arabia. We don't want to make the Saudis mad. And the only president that I know of who ever stood up to the Saudis was John Kennedy, who said in the early 1960s, a century after the U.S. Civil War, that the Saudis had to abolish slavery because it was still being practiced legally in Saudi Arabia. And guess what? They actually did abolish it because the president was willing to make it a major issue and to come out strongly against it, which sends the message that it is possible for us to get them to change if we want them to. And that just as in the case of South Africa, we didn't just say, oh, well, that's Afrikaner culture. We don't care if they treat blacks the way they do. And that we didn't just let U.S. companies do whatever they want and segregate according to the apartheid system. We had the Sullivan principles to get them to change. But we have U.S. companies doing business in Saudi Arabia today that don't let women sit in the same place as men, don't let them enter the restaurant at the same time. This is the way we are complicit in their abuse of human rights. Secondly, they undermine our interests in the Middle East. One of our principal interests in the Middle East is peace. And they do everything they can to sabotage peace. Go back to Camp David. Anwar Sadat told Jimmy Carter at Camp David that the key to the peace was going to be Saudi Arabia supporting it. Because if the Saudis didn't support the peace treaty, there would be no chance of a more comprehensive peace. And Jimmy Carter said, oh, don't worry, I'm Jimmy Carter. Of course, the Saudis will do what I say. And in fact, the Saudis did everything they could to sabotage Camp David. They kicked Egypt out of the Arab League. They canceled all of the foreign aid they were giving to Egypt. And they basically made sure that no other Arab country and the Palestinians would make peace with Israel. Excuse me. They did it again with Obama. Obama came to office basically trying to prove that he was not George W. Bush. That George Bush was seen as Israel's lawyer, that he was seen as anti-Muslim, anti-Arab, and President Obama wanted to show that he was a friend of the Muslim world, a friend of the Arab world, and he wasn't going to be Israel's lawyer. And so what did he do at the very beginning? He criticized Israel. He called for a settlement freeze for negotiations. He had his outreach to the Muslim and Arab world. He gave this famous speech in Cairo. Remember the famous speech he gave in Cairo? Well, do any of you remember where he stopped on his way? Nobody knows because nobody wanted to talk about it at the time, but he stopped in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. And what did he do there? He went to the king and he said, because the State Department Arabists had told him to do all these things because the Saudis would be happy. So he said to the Saudi king, look, you know, I'm beating up on Israel. I'm calling for a Palestinian state. I'm pushing for negotiations. I'm going to repair relations with the Muslim world. What I need you to do is to make some gestures to Israel to show that if they make peace with the Palestinians, that it will be possible to have a broader, comprehensive peace. And the king of Saudi Arabia said, jump in the lake. Well, for the next year, there were a variety of meetings between Saudi officials and U.S. officials with similar kinds of discussions. We want you to make certain gestures to Israel. And it got to be so absurd that at the end of, as I recall, it was the end of the first year of Obama's administration, they were asking the Saudis to let Israel fly over Saudi Arabia. So right now, you know, El Al, no airline can fly over Saudi Arabia from Israel. You know, it was absurd, as if the Israelis would have then said, oh boy, we get to fly 30,000 feet over Saudi Arabia. Now we'll get rid of the West Bank. It was absurd. But it didn't matter anyway, because guess what? The Saudis said, jump in the lake. They wouldn't even let Israel fly 30,000 feet over the country. So Obama eventually figured out that trying to make the Saudis happy by beating up on Israel wasn't going to work, and he eventually has changed his policy, for at least for the last year. So in that way, the Saudis undermine our interest in peace. The third and most important thing, I think, is their involvement in terror. You know about 9/11, of course, but the head of monitoring counterterrorism in the Treasury Department said a couple of years ago, if I could snap my fingers and do one thing to stop one country from supporting terror, it would be Saudi Arabia, because they're the principal sponsors of terror around the world. They are sponsors years ago of PLO terrorism. More recently, they've sponsored Hamas terrorists, which, by the way, also relates to the second point about undermining peace. Here we are trying to support Abbas and Fatah in the peace process, and the Saudis are supporting Hamas, undermining Abbas and his authority. They also are teaching the next generation to be terrorists. They spend billions of dollars, the kind of money that the former Soviet Union used to spend on its propaganda, to create mosques and schools around the world. You may have read, not so long ago, there was a report in England about how Saudi-funded schools were teaching such radical views that it was becoming a security threat in Great Britain. The same thing is happening all over the world. Just to give you an example of what I'm talking about, there was a school funded by the Saudis that had a map of the Middle East on the wall that was missing just one country. And the 12th grade textbook had an entry that said that on the Day of Judgment, the trees will speak and say, O Muslim, O servant of God, the Jews are hiding behind me, come here and kill them. And other textbooks that talked about how Jews were apes and Christians were pigs. And this was not a madrasa in Pakistan or Afghanistan or even in Saudi Arabia. This is a Saudi-funded school in Fairfax, Virginia. So if that's what they're teaching in Virginia, you can imagine what they're teaching in the madrasas. So in this way, they're increasingly trying to infiltrate the education system. And it's not just the Muslim schools. They're now providing textbooks and funding for schools for K through 12 education. They're investing heavily. They've invested about, the Saudis alone, close to $200 million in American universities to try to influence the next generation to present this very sanitized version of Islam and a pro-Saudi view. And to give you an idea of how, again, it's percolating beyond even college campuses. I was giving a talk to the JCRC in Washington, and a person raised their hand and said, I'm a teacher here in Montgomery County Public Schools, and every week I get an email from Georgetown Center of Arab Studies inviting me to some sort of program. Well, the center at Georgetown is funded largely by the Saudis. They have materials that say Saudi Aramco on them that they were passing out at events. I mean, this is the kind of way that they're influencing the next generations. And I believe it's very dangerous. So it's very difficult to do something about it. What do you do when the Saudis have this kind of influence? They have this kind of access. They have access that you don't see through the State Department and through these K Street lobbyists. But one thing we need to do is to begin to stand up and say, look, this is unacceptable. We're not willing to stand by and let them continue to abuse human rights, that we expect them to uphold the same kinds of freedom and democracy that we're calling on Egypt and the other countries in the Arab world to do, that we have to monitor very closely what they're doing on university campuses and on high schools to make sure that these textbooks that present a distorted image of the Middle East aren't being put into our children's hands. We need to make sure members of Congress work toward energy independence and don't just continue to feed this Saudi addiction that allows them to keep us essentially under their thumb. But it's not going to be an easy thing. They have a very entrenched lobby. It's very influential, and we are really at a disadvantage. Let me just stop there and let you ask any questions that you may have about the Arab lobby or anything else going on. Yeah.
I read your book. Can you talk a little bit about the influence in the State Department and the Defense Departments and the background of that? Would you repeat?
Right. The question is about talking about what I talk about in the book about the State Department and Defense Department, basically the Arabist influence. The Arabists, in traditional terms, were people who were very familiar with the Arab world, spoke Arabic fluently, were intimately knowledgeable about the culture and history. And over time, there became another group of Arabists who basically were not necessarily fluent in Arabic, were not necessarily involved in or posted in the Arab world, but began to have this orientation that, again, the most important thing in the world was access to oil. The way to get access to oil was to make the Saudis happy, and the way you made the Saudis happy was to try to drive a wedge or to minimize our relationship with Israel. And it started out before partition, where they opposed the creation of the State of Israel. The Secretary of Defense said, if we agree to partition Palestine into a Jewish and Arab state, we'll all be driving four-cylinder cars. You had them, after the State of Israel was created, basically trying to undo partition. And even today, there's that effort on the part of some of the people in the State Department. And to give you a couple of examples of sort of the mentality of the way many of them think, basically what they've come to believe is they should represent the Arabs to us rather than the United States to the Arab world. And to some degree it makes a little bit of sense, because if you think about it, if you wanted to be in the U.S. Foreign Service, would you study Hebrew? No, because you have exactly one place that you could get a job. But if you study Arabic, you could be in more than 20 places. And think about each embassy in an Arab capital has many foreign service officers. And those foreign service officers rotate around different Arab capitals. And after a while, when you've spent lots of time in Arab capitals, you begin to have an affinity to your hosts. And sometimes it gets to the point where they become what we call, they go native, or they get clientitis. And one of the examples of an ambassador who got clientitis was the U.S. ambassador to Saudi Arabia during the Yom Kippur War, who was telling U.S. oil companies how they should maintain an embargo against their own country, and how they should be lobbying the government against Israel. You had the ambassador who's been in the news during the Obama administration because Obama wanted to appoint him to an intelligence post, a guy named Chaz Freeman, who would said during the Gulf War, after the United States came and saved the Saudis, kept their heads on their shoulders with 500,000 of our young men and women, Freeman said that we shouldn't ask them to pay the cost of the war. And James Baker said he had clientitis so bad that he didn't see that the Saudis had an obligation to pay us back for saving them. But to give you a couple of other examples, one of my favorites was in 1956, there was the Suez War. After the war, the Saudi king was complaining that the Israelis were interfering with pilgrims to Mecca through the Red Sea. And so the State Department told the Israelis, stop doing that. The Israelis said, we're not. Then the king said the Israelis are firing at ships going to the pilgrimage from the Red Sea. The Israelis said, no, we're not. The State Department said, it doesn't matter, don't do it anyway. Then the king of Saudi Arabia said, the Red Sea is an Arab lake. We don't want any Zionist ships in the Arab lake. So the Israelis tied up their ships in a lot. And the king said, we want no ships and no Zionist ships in the Arab lake. So finally the State Department official went to Abba and said, the king wants you to take the ships out of the Red Sea. And finally Abba said, wait a minute, first there was this complaint about interfering with the pilgrims, and then he told us to get our ships out of the Red Sea, we tied them up in a lot. If we take them out of the Red Sea altogether, well, first of all, why should we take them out of the Red Sea? We fought this war in '56 over freedom of the seas, which you supported, and now you're telling us we don't have freedom of our sea. And secondly, if we get our ships out of the Red Sea, will it make any difference to the Saudis? And the State Department official said, no, it won't make any difference, but do it anyway. This is the kind of thing that the way they think. One other example was in the late 60s, the State Department expert on energy wrote a report where he warned that we had to do something because the Arab oil producers were getting too powerful and that they potentially could have an embargo on oil, and we needed to invest in alternative sources of energy like nuclear, wind, solar. You know, could have been written yesterday. But he said none of those things are feasible, so what we have to do instead is screw Israel. That's the mentality, and it continues up until this day, that you have people trying to influence Obama, and I think they did the first 2 years, who said, look, what we need to do is force Israel to free settlements, we have to be critical of Israel, we have to side with the Palestinians to show the Saudis how committed we are to their position, and this is the way we'll bring about peace. And what happened? It didn't bring about peace. The Palestinians ended up saying, we're not going to negotiate at all, which they continue to this day. And the fact of the matter is, the State Department has a 60-year record of perfection. Unlike any other branch of the government, they actually are perfect. That they have proposed peace plans every administration, and none of them have worked. And they never will, because they can't impose peace on parties in the Middle East. Yeah.
For example, if the State Department were to go to Saudi Arabia and say, the U.S. is currently prepared to allow Iran to go ahead and get their nuclear weapon and move to a policy of containment, but there's this other component in the executive branch or wherever in the U.S. government that is willing to actually go ahead and take preventative action. Is there a way to somehow get some kind of concession out of Saudi Arabia in that way? Say, if you do this, we're going to lean on the preventative guys and we'll stop Iran from actually getting its nuclear weapons.
Did you all hear the question?
No.
The question is, basically, can we go to the Saudis and say, we'll take care of this Iranian problem for you if you do something for us? Is that?
Yeah.
And here's the problem, is the State Department never does that. We, from the beginning, could have said to the Saudis, look, you want us to keep your heads on your shoulders? We want you to accept the state of Israel. We want you to make peace with Israel. We want you to support other states making peace with Israel. We've never done that. We just say, whatever you want, we'll give you. We need them a lot less than they need us. You know, if they don't sell us the oil, what are they going to do with it? Drink it? In terms of the Iranian thing, look, who is the one country that has most wanted a war with Iran? Saudi Arabia. We know from WikiLeaks that the Saudis were screaming bloody murder at the United States administration to go and attack Iran, because they're the ones who are the most scared of the Iranians. But we don't tell them, you know, we need you to do certain things for us if you want us to help with Iran. What do? We do just the opposite. We said, oh, here's $30 billion more worth of weapons that you don't need. But you don't need to do anything for us. You just keep, you know, just make sure the price of oil doesn't go too high. That's basically what they do for us. But other than that, nothing. And so the State Department absolutely could say, look, you want us to do certain things for you, you need to do things for us. But it's never going to happen. It's just not the way the State Department thinks. Yeah.
But the Saudis they're paying protection money, then what they really want protection from is from the Iranians. But from a tactical standpoint, nobody really can protect anyone from Iran. And, you know, Iran really has all the cards. All it's got to do is sink one tanker in the Strait of Hormuz and the whole game changes.
Well, yeah, does Iran really have the strategic advantage? I don't think so. The Iranians are not a very strong country. You know, they're a blustering country. If they get nuclear weapons, they will become a big threat, because they can always threaten to use a nuclear bomb or to give it to a terrorist, and that will change everything. The biggest thing it will change is it will force all of the Arab countries to have their own nuclear weapons. You know, I think one of the big mistakes made in the whole debate about Iran is to focus just on Iran. Because some people say, well, so what? Iran gets a bomb, Israel has the bomb, there'll be mutual deterrence. Well, there's arguments against that because Iran doesn't behave necessarily according to the same rationality as the Soviets did during our period of deterrence. But set that aside for a second. Let's assume that you accept that Israel could have deterrence with Iran. What happens then? The Saudis don't accept that. They already have said that if Iran has a bomb, we're going to get one. And then what if the Syrian regime, whatever emerges later, and the Egyptians have a nuclear weapon, and the Iraqis then decide to get one because they certainly are going to be threatened by Iran. Then how are you going to have deterrence between Israel and multiple Arab states? And how is that going to be more secure for the United States if there are multiple nuclear powers in the Middle East? So the Iranians, they can bluster, but our Navy can blow their Navy out of the water in about 30 seconds. Can they create problems and drive up the price of oil? Probably. And it's part of the risk and part of the consequences of taking care of Iran with a military action. But the question is the situation, is the cost going to be even higher, allowing Iran to go ahead and get nuclear weapons? And I think the answer is, yeah, the cost is much greater if they have them. The short-term cost that we'll have to pay to stop them now. Yeah.
Didn't the Saudis just sign an agreement with China to get at their own atomic bomb?
Not a bomb. It's peaceful purposes. In fact, there are at least 12 Arab states that signed nuclear cooperation agreements for peaceful nuclear, including with the United States, by the way. The United States has also signed agreements with a bunch of the Arab countries. But, if you believe that they suddenly decided they needed peaceful nuclear power, then I've got a bridge to sell you in the middle of Kansas. Yeah.
I have two questions. One is, what can we do about the textbooks? I mean, there's an extremely dangerous thing about how the textbooks are being influenced by the Saudis in the United States. And number two is, what about CARE? Are they cooperating with the Saudis? They obviously have a great influence also.
First, the textbooks. This is a really important issue, and to some extent we've been asleep at the wheel. I mean, one thing is you need to monitor what's going on in your child's classroom. I mean, how many of us look and see what the kids are reading in school? I just happened to look at my son's 9th grade history textbook because he was starting to study World War II, and something I know a little bit about, and so I was curious how they covered the Holocaust. And then also how they covered things related to Israel. And, they defined the Holocaust as the killing of 12 million people in World War II. They said that the Yom Kippur War broke out between Israel and Egypt and Syria in 73. Things like that. So we need to see what's in the books and to go to the schools and complain when we find things that are bad, and more importantly, to complain to the publishers. To let them know that they're publishing things that are inaccurate. The real key in the publishing business is Texas and California. Basically, Texas and California create standards for textbooks, and because they're so huge, whatever textbooks they buy end up the textbooks that most of the country buys. And so, most importantly, you have to monitor what goes on in those two states, and there are people who are doing it. There's actually an organization related to the Jewish Community Relations Council in San Francisco that's doing some of this. But it's up to all of us really to monitor, and if some of these Arab publications seep into the classrooms, we have to make sure that the teachers are aware that there are problems with some of them. I'm not saying we shouldn't teach about Islam, or we shouldn't teach about the Muslim world or Muslim history. Absolutely not. I think we need to know much more about that part of the world. We need to know much more about Islam, but we have to be vigilant about the kinds of things that are being taught about it. As far as the, what was the second question?
CARE.
Oh, CARE. CARE is the
Council on
Arab Islamic Relations. I always forget what their acronym stands for, but basically, it's it's part of the Arab lobby. It's focused on defending the rights of Muslims. One of their principal interests is in trying to undermine various security laws which they see as discriminatory in some way against Arabs or Muslims. They have had funding in the past from Arab states, even though they denied it. They tend to, they've had connections, according to certain court documents, to terrorism. They've had members of their organization that have subsequently left who had been found to have connections to terror. Basically, they're a group that promotes this whole notion of Islamophobia, which I think is largely a way to try to keep people from talking about the dangers of radical Islam. But they've become very mainstream. That the State Department and other organizations tend to invite their members to pontificate whenever there's an issue related to Islam or Muslims. And there are others who are trying to expose them for some of the things that they do that I think are unhelpful.
I'm curious about your statement that referring to the first 2 years of Obama's administration as being rather anti-Israel, and that it sounds like you were implying that it was changing. But two things recently really conflict with that in my mind. One was a few weeks ago when Panetta was complaining publicly about how isolated Israel is, and then said, "Get back to the damn table, Israel." Those were his words. This is after the Palestinians had refused to sit down with Israel. He publicly blames Israel. So that had to be with the okay of the Obama administration. And the second thing was just this week, I saw that a headline in the Jerusalem Post that said something to the effect of U.S. confirms Israel money paid for assassinations in Iran. Now, if the U.S. is outing Israel on this, how is this administration, how is that more evidence of this administration's alliance with Israel?
Well, I don't think the United States would out Israel. I don't believe that story for a minute. But in terms of, look, there are things, certainly there have been things that have not been all to Israel's favor. Panetta, in particular, has said a couple of things. Panetta also said that if there is, right before he met with Ehud Barak, coincidentally, that if there was an attack on Iran, it would destroy the world economy. And I wrote an op-ed afterwards saying that this was basically in a kind of anti-Semitic scapegoating, setting up Israel, that if there is an attack and things go badly, Israel's going to get the blame, which is going to happen anyway. But that's problematic. But I think, to be fair, if you look at what's happened in the last year, Obama vetoed the UN resolution about making settlements illegal. He threatened to veto the recognition of Palestine at the UN Security Council. He's given more military assistance to Israel. He just approved a renewal of loan guarantees to Israel. He's repeatedly made statements about standing shoulder to shoulder with Israel. In the last year, he's been about as pro-Israel as any president could be, if you look on all the policies. And I say that as someone very critical of his first 2 years. But I think you have to give credit where credit is due to the things that he has done. He absolutely stopped the Palestinians in their tracks in their whole strategy of trying to internationalize the issue and trying to get the international community to force Israel to capitulate. The question for Jewish voters, pro-Israel voters, is which Obama do you believe? And, I give a lecture on the election campaign, and I basically say, do you believe that Obama saw the light or he saw the polls?
Right.
And it's up to you to decide which it is. I would argue, at least to some degree, he saw the light because he pursued the Arabist policy for 2 years. It didn't work. It backfired. Everybody, I think, pretty much agreed on that, on both sides. And he brought in Dennis Ross, who is not an Arabist, who changed his orientation toward Israel. And So there are things that he's been doing that are very positive. And, again, the question for all of the voters who care about Israel is, do you believe that he really has changed policies, that he does see the light, and he's going to do things differently than he did the first 2 years, or is he going to, take the vote, and now that he doesn't need to be reelected, go back to some other policies that are not as helpful? And I have no way of predicting, and I wouldn't tell anybody else how to think about it. I'm sorry?
What do you mean doesn't need to be reelected?
If he's reelected this time, then he doesn't have to worry in his second term, and so the conventional view is if he doesn't have to worry about being reelected, then he doesn't necessarily care what the pro-Israel community thinks, and he can do whatever he wants to Israel. But that assumes that maybe he wants to do something that's harmful to Israel, and there are plenty of people who don't think that's the case, that he's very sympathetic. Yeah.
What do you think of Israel continuing to expand the settlements?
What do I think of Israel continuing to expand settlements? I hear a landmine going off.
Take a drink.
I need something stronger than water. What do I think about settlements? Settlements are a complex issue in some ways. First, empirically, as a political scientist, I think it's easy to prove that settlements are not the obstacle to peace. Plain and simple. All I have to do is say, what happened between 1949 and 1967? Why wasn't there peace? There wasn't a single settlement. From 67 to 77, there were a handful of settlements. There was no peace. 77, Begin gave up the settlements in the Sinai in exchange for peace. We had a laboratory example in Gaza. Israel tested this proposition. Settlements and occupation are the obstacles to peace. Well, there is no occupation in Gaza. There are no settlements. Where's the peace? Now, that's not the same thing as to say settlements are a good idea. I think you can make the case that building settlements, certainly in certain parts of the territories, still may not be a good idea because it puts a drain on the Israeli economy. It forces the military to divert resources to defend people in places where they're probably not going to stay in the long run. There are a variety of reasons for why it may not be a good thing. Israel hasn't really expanded settlements. They really haven't built any new settlements. They've expanded within the existing settlements, mostly within the existing ones, which everyone in Israel agrees are going to remain part of Israel in any future settlement. Basically, even the Palestinians agreed to this, and Bill Clinton in the Clinton plan also agreed that basically there are 5 settlement blocks which will remain part of Israel. And this is where the majority of Jewish settlers live. And the question is, what happens to those in the smaller outlying communities, most of which have fewer than 500 people? Most of them are in fairly remote places. And most Israelis have said that they expect those to be evacuated. So I think there are certain things that Israel does that clearly aren't helpful. This president doesn't like settlements. There aren't very many people in the United States government who do. And so anytime Israel announces we're going to build more, it's just a way of pissing off the president. The question is, do you really want to do that? Is that necessary? Is there another way to do it? And then there's a separate issue of the illegal settlements. I mean, settlements that, according to Israeli law, are illegal, and that Israel has in the past said we will dismantle. There's a whole question about why that hasn't been done. They have dismantled some of them, but not all of them. That's problematic politically in terms of the relations with the United States as well. So, look, settlements are a question for Israelis to decide to some degree, but in terms of the relationship with the peace process and the Palestinians, it has nothing to do with it. Because the whole issue of the settlement freeze, to go back to Obama's mistake, when he called for a settlement freeze in order to have negotiations, that was something the Palestinians never did. Mahmoud Abbas had 35 meetings with Ehud Olmert when he was the prime minister, and never once said there had to be a settlement freeze before they had talks. Never in any of the negotiations. And none of the Oslo agreements require Israel to stop building settlements. Obama introduced this idea, and then Abbas was in the position of saying, hey, how can I be less pro-Palestinian than Obama? And it actually made the situation worse. And now Abbas got up on this tree and he can't get off. So now he continues to maintain that Israel has to freeze the settlements until he'll talk. And, you know, he can do that until the end of time. It's not going to help him. In fact, you know, what I always argue is the biggest builder of settlements is Mahmoud Abbas. Because the longer the Palestinians put off making peace, the more settlers there are going to be. I mean, if you look at it, if the Palestinians had accepted that autonomy plan of Menachem Begin in 77 or 78, they would have inevitably had a state today, and there would have been 10,000 Jews living in the West Bank. If they would have fulfilled Oslo in 93, there were something like 120,000 settlers. If they would have accepted the Clinton plan in 2000, by then there were 200,000 settlers. They didn't do it. The longer they wait, now you know how many settlers there are? Something like 350,000. So who is it benefiting, you know, if Abbas keeps waiting to make peace? Does he really think that if he waits till 2020 things are going to be better? There'll be 350, 400,000 Jews living in the territories. And they'll have that much less land for whatever state there might be if there's a two-state solution. Sorry for filibustering that question. Yeah.
Sometimes we assume that whatever the Israeli official policy is has the majority backing of the Israeli citizens. Are there polling numbers out that suggest, you know, it's 51% or 99% in favor of this or that?
Well, there are always polls that show, you know, different things on different issues. It depends on what the issue is. You know, the assumption is that this is a democratic government, and the democratic government is reflecting the will of the people, and it may not be a majority. You know, think in this country, if you do a poll, for example, on gun control, they routinely show that most Americans support gun control, and yet our government doesn't pass the kind of gun control that those polls call for. So are we undemocratic? Is our government not representative? We wouldn't think so. We would say we would still support the government even if it's not reflecting the position of the people on every single issue. And the same, I think, goes for Israel. This is why, you know, my basic view on American Jewish attitudes toward Israel in terms of public policy is that we have no choice but to support the elected government of the State of Israel, because they're reflecting the democracy of the people, the democracy of Israel. And if we're substituting our views for the views of the Israeli electorate, then basically there's no consistency, because then it's whatever individual Jews should think Israel's policy should be. And we would never be able to have any kind of a strong lobby. What makes our pro-Israel lobby as strong as it is the fact that we are unified, to the extent Jews ever are unified, to believe that we support the elected government of Israel on issues of peace and security, because they're the ones who have to live with the consequences. We don't. We don't send our kids to fight. They do. So there are people here in the United States who believe otherwise. They have the Arabist view. Another Arabist school of thought is we need to save Israel from itself. And this is the view of certain American Jewish organizations too. We know better what's good for Israel. And Israelis need to be, need to be saved. We need the United States government to force them to do what's good for them. And there was a famous article by a State Department official that was called "How to Save Israel in Spite of Itself." And this is what, many State Department officials who say that they're supporters of Israel believe that just Israelis don't know what's good for them. And so, or they don't know what's good for American interests, and we have to therefore force them to do these things. And I just believe that that is fundamentally undemocratic. We don't do that with any other country.
Is J Street an example of that?
I wasn't going to mention any names. Yeah.
Just so you know.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Actually, that was my question. I hear that J Street is more accepted in Israel than it is in America.
I don't think they're accepted in Israel.
No.
That's what I've heard.
But one of the arguments you hear is, and this comes up on campuses a lot, is, look, Israelis criticize their government. Why shouldn't we be just as critical of Israelis, of the government? You know, if you want to read criticism of Israel, I tell people all the time when I have my media bias lecture, you know, people talk about the bias in the media, and I say, look, if you want to read the most vicious criticism of the Israeli government, pick up Haaretz any day of the week. So yeah, of course Israelis criticize their government, but there's a difference between Israelis criticizing their government and Americans criticizing the Israeli government. Here's the main difference is, almost all Israelis have the same life experience. First of all, they're all Israelis. They're all living with the consequences of their government's decisions. They've all gone through similar schooling. They know similar things about their history. They mostly have gone to the army. They have a common narrative. Now, the problem in the United States is that's not true. That we don't all have a common narrative, a common experience, a common understanding about Israel. So when you have American Jews here criticizing the government of Israel, it depends on the audience. If they're talking to a general audience who doesn't know anything about Israel, the only thing they're hearing is the criticism. They don't know the context of the criticism. They don't know anything else about Israel. If you're in a room of people who are very knowledgeable about Israel, and I say this to students, you know, if you're in the Hillel and you want to have a discussion and you want to talk about all of the failures or flaws in Israel, there's no reason why you shouldn't feel comfortable doing that. It's good to be able to express your concerns about Israel. But it's very different if you go out into the quad or you go out into a public lecture and you make those same comments, because the people listening to you don't know the context. They don't have the same common experiences as you do. So I think the idea that just because Israelis criticize Israel justifies us doing it is just completely wrong-headed. It's counterproductive. It undermines our support for Israel, and I think it undermines American support for Israel. Yeah.
It seems like one of the most dangerous things we've done is create power vacuums in Egypt and Libya, and then not really done anything to see to it that they're filled by good governments, leaving it open for Al-Qaeda or Muslim Brotherhood.
We've created power vacuums in Libya and Egypt. Well, there's a limit to how much we can do about these countries that are in turmoil at the moment. A lot of people thought it was a big mistake that we didn't support Mubarak, because they saw the handwriting on the wall. You know, just go back and read all the commentaries who said, look, the most powerful interests in Egypt are the Muslim Brotherhood, and if you go to elections, they're going to win. And they had all these American officials, oh no, don't worry about the Muslim Brotherhood, they're not so bad, they're not really going to win. Look at all these young people who use Facebook and Twitter, and they're Democrats, you know, they're just like Americans on the American college campuses. It was ridiculous. It was, you know, so naive and so, unaware of Middle East history. And we got exactly what most Middle East experts knew would happen. Now we're in a problem. We have a difficult situation. Look, one problem we have is what I call the democracy paradox. The United States believes in freedom and democracy. We can't go out and say, we don't want freedom and democracy in the Middle East. We want good dictators who are pro-American. We may support them, and we may, think that, but we don't publicly go out and say that. We have to say we support freedom and democracy. I think we really do. But the problem now in Egypt in particular is it's a very complicated situation, because freedom and democracy is going to bring the Muslim Brotherhood to power, who don't believe in freedom and democracy. They believe in creating an Islamic regime, which isn't going to be democratic, isn't going to give human rights to the people once they're in power. There's this confusion that election equals democracy. They're not synonymous. As Sharansky says, one election, one man, one vote, one time isn't democracy. But in Egypt, you have the military, which is really in power now. We don't like that because they're a military government. They weren't democratically elected. But on the other hand, they've got all of our guns. A lot of them. They're the most powerful military in the region. And they are willing to be pro-American and keep the peace treaty with Israel. And do we want to then undermine the military and try to give more power to these Muslim extremists who aren't going to be pro-American, want to renege on the peace treaty, and want to impose an Islamic theocracy on their people? How do you balance that? How do you support the military and not look undemocratic? I think it's a very difficult position that we've gotten ourselves into. And the same thing's going to happen in Syria. Now everybody wants us to support the rebels. Okay, so we're going to support the rebels. Maybe we're going to get rid of Assad. Who are we going to end up with? We're going to end up with other Muslim extremists in most likelihood. The Israelis believe they're going to be completely surrounded by Islamists. And so the question, one of the debates you hear now is you have American officials who saying, and some others, Israelis, who say, look, now's the time we need peace with the Palestinians because of this stuff going on. And then there are other people who say, and I'd be among them, say, no, this is the last time that you want to make more concessions when you don't know what's going to go on, all around your borders. This is you want to be in an even more vulnerable position. Never mind the fact that the Palestinians themselves have no interest in peace at the moment, and they're allying with Muslim fundamentalists. And by the way, maybe you read this, that the Mufti of Jerusalem used that same quote that I said was in the Saudi textbook a couple of weeks ago, about the Muslims hearing from the trees to kill the Jews. I mean, this is a view in the Palestinian world as well.
Well, I'd like some clarification on, you say the Saudis have fear of Iran, and yet you think President Obama has changed since his first 2 years in terms of wanting to be, sort of more working for peace. But why didn't Obama support the Iranian revolutionaries, the young people there? To me, it seems as though Obama is definitely behind getting Americans to think of Iran as a threat so that we can go and wage war against Iran. Why didn't we help those people if we helped everybody else?
Well, we weren't helping everybody else at the time that the when we needed to help them. I mean, you're absolutely right.
If Iran's the biggest threat, why weren't we helping them?
You're absolutely right. Lots of people were saying at the time that we should have been helping the Iranian people who wanted to overthrow this regime, and we didn't. You're right. And we weren't supporting democracy in the Middle East at all until Tahrir Square. I mean, suddenly we discovered democracy. Bush had done it before. He was the first one, really, to get rid of what we called the democracy exception. I mean, the United States, for better or worse, we intervened all over the world, right? In Latin America especially, we were always trying to bring about democratic governments and trying to overthrow dictators we didn't like. We did that everywhere in the world except the Middle East. And it wasn't until Bush came along and said, we're going to start pursuing democracy in the Middle East too. Obama was against it until Cairo. He suddenly changed his position. So you're right. He didn't do it with the Iranians.